My Govanen, welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and this video is a follow-up to a video I did several weeks back on why did it take so long for Gandalf to realize that Bilbo's ring was the One Ring. That video really took off recently, and tons of comments got left on it compared to my normal volume, and there were some actually really interesting counterpoints and theories that got dropped in those comments. And so I wanted to address some of them in this video and explain why I don't think they, maintain the plot hole and or how to get around the problems presented by some of them. So let's take a look at some of these really nice comments. I apologize in advance, by the way, that I don't remember who all left what comment and I forgot to write it down. So unfortunately, you'll have to find them, but anybody who wrote comments will probably recognize them within this context. Before I get too deep into it, I want to get a couple of one really category of ideas out of the way, and that's a lot of people left comments basically saying, why wouldn't Gandalf just check to make sure that it wasn't the One Ring? So this is mainly explained by the fact that Saruman had been telling the White Council the ring is gone. Saruman is the expert on the rings. That's his area of study. Gandalf even tells Frodo, it's like, this isn't my thing, this is Saruman's thing, and he doesn't like meddling, so I never, I don't touch his field of study, basically, is what he's implying. And you also have to remember, Saruman has the power of convincing people. Aragorn says this to the hobbits at one point. He says, Saruman, the wise he could persuade and the lesser people he could daunt. So, even people like Gandalf and Elrond and Galadriel and all of them, Saruman could probably persuade a little bit more easily in this context because A, none of them want to believe that the ring is still around. It's not a comfortable thought. But B, also, before they know he's a bad guy, they have no particular reason to be on their guard. So it would make sense that Gandalf, at the time of the Lord of the Rings, well, at Bilbo's party, let's say, doesn't yet think there's really any possibility that it's the One Ring. And therefore, why would he tell Bilbo he just needs to check to be sure? It's like he's already got the authority of the world's foremost expert who's on his side in fighting Sauron that it can't possibly be. So why would he mess with it? Gandalf does tell Frodo that he, at numerous points, told Bilbo that you shouldn't use that ring too much, and Bilbo resented it, so he kind of left it alone and said, I didn't really have any right to do anything about it, and what could I do anyway? So I mean, he's clearly worried about Bilbo because of the potential issues the ring might cause, even if it's not the One Ring, but it's like he doesn't have the right to take it from him, so what's he going to do? So I just wanted to put that out there as an explanation for the many, many, many comments that all kind of hit on the same theme of, he should have at least checked it, done some research, whatever. So, I think that explains that pretty well. Now let's look at two separate issues in specific comments that got raised that I think are really, really, really interesting. So the first one is a theory that Galadriel could actually tell when Frodo put the ring on, and that anybody who wields one of the three rings would also be able to tell this. And the theory comes from the fact that at the pool, at the Mirror of Galadriel, rather, Galadriel tells Frodo, when they're talking about the ring, Frodo says, why can't I see the minds of other people when I wear the ring? And Galadriel says, you haven't tried. Don't try. It would break your mind. You have to train yourself to the domination of other wills. And she also tells him, you've only put it on 3 times since you owned it. Since he set out from the Shire. I forget exactly how she words it. And the theory is kind of jumping off from this comment by Galadriel. How does she know that he put the ring on 3 times? Now, seemingly there's a little bit of support for this theory in the letter that Gandalf leaves with Barlam and Butterbur at the Prancing Pony Inn at Bree. Because in the letter, Gandalf uses an interesting phrase. He says, do not use it again, referring to the ring, of course. Why would he say again unless he had already done it? And so you're tempted to think, because of course by this point, Frodo has already put the ring on at once in the story. at Tom Bombadil's house. He'll later, the other two that Galadriel is referring to are at Weathertop and at the Prancing Pony Inn itself when he crashes, when he's doing the man in the moon song, and falls down and accidentally puts the ring on. This is not anything like the movie. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's because this is what happens in the book. So the 3 times that he puts it on before Lothlorien are in Tom Bombadil's house, at the Prancing Pony, shortly before he gets the letter, but clearly after it was written, and then at Weathertop when the Nazgul attack. So he's already put it on once, and so we might be tempted to read that again as meaning, you've already used it on the way too, but don't do it again. The problem with this is, if you pay attention to the history, the letter was written at midsummer, meaning between June and July, according to the Shire calendar, and Bilbo didn't set out from the Shire until September 22nd, and therefore wasn't in the house of Tom Bombadil until after September 22nd. So that letter, even though it uses the word again, doesn't really have anything to do with Gandalf knowing that Frodo has used it. He may be presuming that Frodo had used it at some point in the prior 17 years since Bilbo left after his farewell party. That may be what he's referring to. But it's certainly not referring to anything Frodo did after he left the Shire, or even after, he had his talk with Gandalf about what the ring was. So, tempting as it might be to see that reference as supporting the idea that Gandalf has some kind of psychic link whenever Frodo puts the ring on, it really doesn't. So then we return to the question of, well, did Galadriel actually have some kind of link? Because one of the things that we do know about the One Ring is when Sauron first puts it on, Celebrimbor is aware of him. Celebrimbor is the one who forged the 3 rings. He and the other elven wise who had the 3 elven rings were aware of Sauron when he put the One Ring on, and therefore took them off and were not able to be dominated by Sauron. This kind of glitch in Sauron's plan, because his goal was, they're going to have these rings on, and I'm going to put this on, and I'm going to dominate them because I put a back door into the technology of whatever went into these rings. Of course, he doesn't know directly about the 3 rings anyway, because they were forged by Celebrimbor alone. But the point is, when they take their rings off, Sauron gets mad, and that sets off like one of his major campaigns in the Second Age, trying to wipe out the elves, because he's like, playing foil. Let's just do it the old-fashioned way and kill them all. So they all know when Sauron puts on the ring. So the theory is Galadriel and Elrond and Gandalf can also tell when someone puts on the One Ring. The reason I don't think this theory works is this would imply that every time Smeagol or Gollum, whatever you want to call him, put on the ring, one of the wise with the 3 elven rings would have known. And then Gandalf must have known long before, like 500 years before the events of The Lord of the Rings, that the One Ring was still extant. Somebody had it. And then it wouldn't have been a question of trusting Saruman or not as to the question of whether it rolled down, to the sea in the river. It would have been like he had direct knowledge, and so would Galadriel and Elrond. Galadriel especially, because Galadriel is almost certainly one of the 3 who had a ring at the time Sauron, put his ring on. If anybody besides Celebrimbor did, it would have been Galadriel. Elrond ends up getting his from Gil-galad after, a lot of events that transpire, so he wouldn't have been one of the originals, and Gandalf certainly wasn't one of the originals. So Galadriel, if anybody, would have been one of the ones to have direct experience of the same exact thing. So, in that sense, you could maybe argue that maybe Gandalf is getting some kind of tingle but doesn't really know what it is, and the same for Elrond, but I still don't think it works. Because even with that, you still have to think, well, then Galadriel, she's going to be getting the same kind of message, and she's, if she knows that it's Frodo putting on the ring, then she would also have to know that Smeagol had put on the ring, or, that Bilbo used the ring. I mean, there's tons of uses of the ring between Diagal finding it in the riverbed and then Frodo getting all the way to Lothlorien. There's tons of them. Smeagol, we know, used it multiple times as Gollum in the Misty Mountains to kill orcs when he needed food, or even before he was kicked out of his home, he used the ring to get secrets that he could use to gain leverage over other people. So Galadriel at least would have known for 500 years that the ring was still around. So when Saruman said, "Hey, I've studied this," it rolled away, and she's like, "No, I have inside knowledge that that's not what happened." So to me, this theory just can't work. And the reason I think it doesn't work is because, unlike Sauron, who knew what the ring did and forged it such that he could use it specifically and was using it specifically for its intended purpose, neither Diagol, nor Smeagol, nor Bilbo, nor Frodo at any point other than after Gandalf has his conversation with Frodo knew what the ring was, knew what it was for, or knew how to use it. None of them were using it to dominate the wills of others. And even after Frodo finds out what it is, the 3 times he uses it once in Tom Bombadil's house to make sure it is what it seems to be. Whether that's a rationalization, spurred by the ring itself is another question, but at any rate, he does it. But he's not doing it to dominate anybody else's will. He puts it on at the Prancing Pony seemingly by accident, although that accident may have been orchestrated by the ring, let's say. And then he puts it on at Weathertop out of sheer terror to escape the Nazgul. That's like, the only 3 times he ever uses it, and all of them have nothing to do with dominating anybody else's will or, even seeing inside somebody else's mind. He's not tried it. So again, there's no reason for Galadriel to get some kind of a psychic tingle out of this through her own elven ring, because he's not doing what Sauron did when he first put on the One Ring, which was, I'm going to put this on and I'm going to use it immediately. So I don't think that theory really holds water. Now, there's one other comment. Well, there's probably more than one that kind of hit on this, but one that went a little more in depth that talks about something a little more problematic for my explanation. So let's talk about that. After I finished recording this video, I realized I'd forgotten to mention, how do I explain how Galadriel knew Frodo had put the ring on 3 times? Well, we could imagine, for example, that they had had conversations that we don't know about, but I think it's pretty clear in the text that they didn't really see Celeborn and Galadriel after the first meeting until Frodo then sees her at the Mirror of Galadriel. But we also know that Galadriel is kind of telepathic and can read minds. Boromir makes that fairly clear in terms of what his experience was in the first meeting, and, we get the impression that all of the Fellowship had some kind of experience of Galadriel kind of probing their own minds. So when she says to Frodo, "You've put the ring on 3 times," I don't think that's because she has direct experience of that through the ring. I think that's because she has read his mind, at least to that extent. That's how I would explain that comment. Anyway, back to the main argument. So the key thing here is, my theory from the original video was Gandalf didn't recognize Bilbo's as the One Ring because Saruman had already told everybody the One Ring is gone, and there's a lot of lesser rings in the world that look just like the One Ring. They're unadorned, they're just simple rings. And therefore, there's nothing really to set off his warning bells yet until Bilbo's birthday party, and then the way he acts is like, whoa, that's too much. I've got to check this out. So that was my original theory. The problem with the theory is that in talking to Frodo about the history of the ring and whatnot, he tells Frodo, "I wondered often." Well, actually, let me just read the actual quote from the book and make sure I get it right. "When did I first begin to guess?" he mused, searching back in memory. "Let me see. It was in the year that the White Council drove the Dark Power from Mirkwood, just before the Battle of the 5 Armies, that Bilbo found his ring. A shadow fell on my heart then, though I did not know yet what I feared. I wondered often how Gollum came by a great ring, as plainly it was. That at least was clear from the first. Then I heard Bilbo's strange story of how he had won it, and I could not believe it." Now there's a longer piece of the quote that I'm going to get to later, but the main thing here is he says plainly it was a great ring from the first, and he had just gotten through telling Frodo, the rings of power, or the great rings, are distinct from the lesser rings which by Saruman's words we can take to mean the lesser rings are the ones that are plain and unadorned and don't really look like anything special. The great rings are the ones that all have their proper gem except the one, and the ones that are the most significant. And here, when Gandalf says that Gollum clearly had a great ring, presumably the reason he's saying that is Gollum's life was extended by it, because that's what great rings do. We don't get any indication that lesser rings do that, but Gandalf specifically mentions the great rings, if you use them often, you will not die. You'll kind of just continue on and eventually fade. So the problem presented here, of course, is he's saying he clearly had a great ring. Now there's almost a secondary plot hole here, because how does Gandalf know that Gollum clearly had a great ring? Why is that obvious? Because he doesn't know anything about Gollum at this point. Well, let me say, not at this point, but so much at the point where he learns Bilbo has the ring. He doesn't know Gollum has been around the Misty Mountains for like 400 plus years eating goblins. He doesn't know that. So he doesn't know how long Gollum has lived. So why would he know right off the bat? And this leads to a potential answer to the problem. Arguably, you could say when he says that he clearly had a great ring, what he means is once he found out about Gollum and who he was and how long he'd been around, that made it plain. But he says that was plain from the first. And so it's really difficult to understand how he knows exactly why Gollum must have had a great ring. I'm not exactly sure how to reconcile that problem, but there are two possible explanations for Gandalf still not really having suspected Bilbo's of being the One Ring that I think we could look at. One of them requires me to revise my theory presented in my earlier video, and the other does not. The one example that would not require me to revise my theory is that when Gandalf says Great Ring in this particular context, he's using it a little more loosely to mean just magic ring. And the reason this is at least a possible interpretation is that we do have several instances, mostly in the Council of Elrond, I think, where the term Great Ring gets used specifically to refer to the ring of Sauron himself, the One Ring. And Boromir, for instance, uses the phrase the Great Ring of the enemy, or, the Great Ring, or whatever it is. And there are other instances out there as well that clearly refer to just the One Ring as the Great Ring. Now, the tricky thing with that is Tolkien, and presumably by extension Gandalf, don't just use terms willy-nilly. Great Ring is capitalized in that conversation with Frodo at every point that it is used. When he tells him the rings of power, or the great rings, that's capital G, capital R. And when he says Gollum clearly had a great ring, capital G, capital R. I don't see Tolkien using that phrase in a totally different way than the way in which he just used it to distinguish it from the lesser rings. That just does not seem likely. So I don't necessarily think that explanation is a very good explanation. You could force it to work if you really wanted to. But the other problem with the theory to me is, if, when you're referring to the Great Ring, it's obvious that you're referring to the One Ring, because it's the singular Great Ring. Whereas, to refer to all the magic rings, greater or lesser, as great rings, capital G, capital R, that doesn't seem to make any kind of sense. It's easy enough to explain the Great Ring as being distinct because it's the Great Ring, as opposed to the Great Rings, meaning all the ones mentioned in the famous poem. Not so easy to explain why Gandalf would say, a great ring, capital G, capital R, and mean really just any old magic ring, probably one of the lesser ones. That doesn't seem likely to me. So even though this would save my theory, I don't like it as an explanation. The second explanation, which would, I think, make some sense, but would require me to abandon my earlier theory, is that when he says he clearly had a great ring, he's probably thinking, well, it must be one of the 7 or one of the 9. And the reason you would, maybe reach that conclusion is, okay, so we've known for a long time that the 7 have either been devoured or recovered by Sauron, or the 9, of course, the Nazgul have. And part of my argument in the earlier video was, we know where all these other rings are, and part of Gandalf's argument at the Council of Elrond is, we know where all the other rings are, but Sauron really, really wants this one, so it can only be one. So the reason I think this argument works is there's some possibility that one of the 7 was in fact not destroyed by Dragonfire and not recovered by Sauron. It could be presumed destroyed by Dragonfire, but it turns out, somebody else found it. Maybe some really intrepid horde thief managed to get into a dragon horde, make it out with a ring, not knowing what it was, and then somehow it came to Gollum. And they're all, they're what knowledge they have of the dragon rings and the rings returned to Sauron one way or another. Perhaps what information they have is incomplete enough that Gandalf can think, okay, maybe this is just one of the 7. Potentially also one of the 9, because the last time the Nazgul were seen anywhere was a long, long time ago, basically the fall of Angmar. And that was way back in history, before Gollum found the ring. There were times that they were suspected of being the necromancer at Dol Guldur and other, doing other activity around Middle-earth, but the 9 were never seen as a group, all 9, after that point. And so theoretically, one of them had been killed, or maybe Sauron just took that ring and decided, I'm going to put it back out there in circulation to see if I can get something else to happen with it. There's possibilities along those lines. And you have to remember at this point, when Gandalf is talking about the fates of the various rings, he now knows, when he says that at the Council of Elrond, that all 9 of the Nazgul are around and hunting, because all 9 of them were pursuing Frodo. So now at that point, he definitely knows the 9 are all still in play, all held by the Nazgul. So that is no longer an option. But when he first talked to Frodo, in April, June, whatever it was, prior to Frodo leaving, he didn't necessarily know that. He doesn't know the 9 are abroad even until after he leaves the Shire and meets Radagast, who tells him, you've got to go to Saruman right now. So there's a little bit of wiggle room in there. Now, the problem you run into there is, yeah, but what about that whole issue of, the great rings all had their proper gemstone? The way I get around this is the fact that when Gandalf says that, he says, I recalled the words of Saruman to that effect when I had all but abandoned the hope of finding Gollum. And, I was with Aragorn, we were searching around, and I wasn't finding anything. And then I remembered this. And then I was like, well, maybe we don't need to find Gollum after all. So he remembers that, and then immediately goes to Minas Tirith, finds what he's looking for, then immediately goes to Mirkwood after he hears that Aragorn has got Gollum and brought him there, questions Gollum, and immediately goes to Frodo. So all of those events happen in really quick succession. So it's not clear that prior to that point that Gandalf had a clear memory that Saruman had said all the great rings have their own proper gemstone. He knows, of course, that his own Elven ring does, and probably knows that Elrond's and Galadriel's do, because they probably all know each other, have a ring. And even if they don't, it's like you could, it doesn't matter. But he's never set eyes on a dwarven ring. He's never set eyes, certainly, on one of the 9 that he knows of. So he doesn't know that at that point. And so theoretically, that could still be an option. So now I want to look back at the rest of that quote that I started earlier and see how that fits in, because it kind of is important here. So he just gotten through saying, it was clear from the first that he had the great ring. Then I heard Bilbo's strange story of how he had won it, and I could not believe it. When I at last got the truth out of him, I saw at once that he had been trying to put his claim to the ring beyond doubt, much like Gollum with his birthday present. The lies were too much alike for my comfort. Clearly the ring had an unwholesome power that set to work on its keeper at once. That was not, I mean, that was the first real warning I had that all was not well. I told Bilbo often that such rings were better left unused, but he resented it, and soon got angry. There was little else that I could do. I could not take it from him without doing greater harm, and I had no right to do so anyway. I could only watch and wait. I might perhaps have consulted Saruman the White, but something always held me back. So here, his reference to the unwholesome power that's getting Bilbo to lie about how he gets the ring, this kind of supports the idea that he thinks that it really is one of the greater rings and that it's doing basically what it was intended to do, corrupt its wielder. The lesser rings, I tend to suspect, were not that corruptive because they were just, as he puts it, more or less toys and essays in the craft of ring making and not terribly potent. So, and that actually reminds me, going back to what I said about how he knew Gollum had a great ring, perhaps the reason he thought that was clear was because of the invisibility. Maybe the lesser rings don't do that. That's a possibility that's not clear in the text, but it just occurred to me, so maybe that's it. At any rate, he's seeing this corruptive ability of the ring on Frodo and thinking, okay, that's not good. But he's also recognizing, I don't have the right to take it from him, and even if I did, it would just make matters worse with Bilbo. And he says that I could have consulted Saruman the White, but something held me back. That something, of course, is probably Providence or his own intuition about what's going on with Saruman telling him he's not on the up and up anymore. So that, of course, all turns out for the best, because if he had consulted with Saruman, things probably would have gone much worse. At any rate, I think this kind of supports the theory that he thought Bilbo might have had one of the 7 or one of the 9. And when he says consult with Saruman, he's thinking, consult with Saruman about, like, which ring is this? You're the one that's the expert on all the rings. What does this guy have? But something held him back, and so he didn't. And he didn't have any other way of taking action. And, until much, 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 much later, he doesn't remember the words of Saruman about the description of the rings to then go, hey, wait, I can go find out where he got his information and see if I can double check it that way. So the only thing about this that still leaves a little bit of a lingering plot hole that I'm not sure I could plug, and it's not really a plot hole at this point. When Gandalf realizes, oh wait, Saruman got this information somewhere, let me go run over to Minas Tirith. You would think if Saruman had, said this about the rings all having their proper gemstone, he would immediately then be able to rule out, well, it's not a dwarven ring, and it's not one of the 9, and it's not one of the 3, and it's a great ring, so therefore it's the one ring. Therefore, why didn't he just hightail it back up to Frodo? Well, I would say that because he's already in the realm of Gondor pretty much, or on its borders, searching around Mordor trying to find Gollum, he's, more or less going to go by Minas Tirith anyway. And so he goes there, hunts for what he finds, and then he immediately gets word pretty much that Aragorn captured Gollum. So he's like, I'm just going to wrap up all the loose ends. I'm going to find out for sure everything I can about this, and then I'm going to go back to Frodo, which doesn't take him a whole lot of extra time. And so I don't see that necessarily as a problem. And also, filling out all the loose ends, to make, again, I go back to the problem of Saruman convincing all the wise. He's probably still lingering under the effect of Saruman putting forth whatever power he had in his voice to, make sure all the wise believed the one ring is out there. It's out in the sea. We're never going to see it again. Don't worry about it. He is closing off every avenue of what, argument that might be made that we don't have to worry about this ring because it's not the one. He's, closing off all the doors, sealing off all the windows, dotting his I's, crossing his T's, getting everything done to make sure, all right, I'm going to know for sure, and it's not going to be under any debate after I'm done with this. So that, I think, is a good explanation enough for why Gandalf wouldn't go straight from the hunt for Gollum to Frodo. Also, the fact that he's not anticipating Sauron finding the Shire like tomorrow at that point. He's not really worried about that. It's not until after he leaves Frodo again that he learns the 9 are abroad, and so I don't think he's going to be super worried about, the Shire being immediately found and ransacked and, whatever. So that, I think, is probably the best explanation, and so I'm officially revising my theory from the earlier video. However, I'm going to leave that earlier video up because it does have a lot of useful background for this video. So I'm going to link to the earlier video in the description, and I'm going to cross-link from the earlier video to this one as well, so anybody watching either can get both. But that is, hopefully, the final word on why it's not a plot hole that Gandalf took so long to figure out that Bilbo's ring was the One Ring. So, hope you enjoyed that video, and I hope it tied off all the remaining loose ends on this theory about Gandalf not figuring out the ring situation as a plot hole. If you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up, share it around. You can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore for some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions. Please also subscribe, and don't forget to click that bell icon for more videos every Monday. And I'm also now on Rumble as well if you want to check me out there. And you can support me over on Patreon. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.